Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And just before we get to today's show, if you're expecting to see the incredible Rana Mitter on Sunday, various complications at his end, it's now been rescheduled for next Sunday. First, when Rana is going to be coming on and talking particularly about the famine in China, the social impact of the war over there. So he will be coming on. He's very, very busy and he apologizes, but it's Sunday. So if you're new to the channel, and there are a few new people who've come in because of the content, thank you for coming along. If you would like to, please consider becoming a patron or a channel member. And don't forget, all the information you need is in the description below, where you can find my guests' Twitter accounts and their work and their websites or their books or whatever it is they're doing. But today we are back to talking about the Sino-Japanese War, and my guest earned a BA and MA in history in China, and she is now in New Jersey, and she specializes in the US and East Asian relations. And Aries Li is joining us today to talk about the Flying Tigers and kind of historiography and legacy and how they were perceived both in the USA and around the world. And I'm delighted that we have her as a guest. So good afternoon. How are you today, Aries?
Good afternoon, Paul. Thanks very much for having me. I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm really good. So the Flying Tigers, and we'll get into the presentation in a minute, is one of those areas that a lot of people have a little bit of knowledge about, because there was a movie back in the 40s. It's something you can go to an air show and buy a jacket with the Flying Tigers on. So it's known in the USA, known in China, known about around the world. But why, with all the subjects that could be covered with regards to the Asia Pacific campaign, what was it about it that you wanted to bring to our attention today? What is it you think is important to discuss?
So this what I'm going to present today is actually a very small section of my dissertation, which studies the profound but overlooked legacy of U.S.-China World War II military cooperation, and how this cooperation, the legacy, the memory, and narrative of this cooperation kind of shaped or influenced the later relations between the Chinese and Americans. So that is my perspective here. And for the Flying Tigers, I think because they are the very early unit that actually had materialized this cooperation. And I think it's very important to see how the memory of the Flying Tiger changed, and how the narrative of the Flying Tiger kind of maybe, I mean, in later decades, which I'm not going to address too much today in the presentation, is how they kind of help reimagine the reimagination of American-Chinese relations in the later decades.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's going to be coming up later on in other shows this week, is that, you know, Zach Fredman, tomorrow, the interpretation of the relations, there's lots of layers to it. It's very nuanced. There's the kind of propaganda image of the war, just like with the Americans with Stalin, that kind of Uncle Joe aspect of it being a very, very positive thing. And of course, at a lower level, it's much more complicated. There's all sorts of things going on, and there's, you know, political sort of things behind the scenes and cultural differences and anyway. But we'll get on with the presentation. You've come with a PowerPoint, which I'll load up on screen, which you're in charge. And folks, we'll do the questions kind of at the end today, I think. But if there's anything particularly about what's on screen that you really want to just have any bit of a finer detail on, please put your question up and we'll address it as we go along. But really, we intend to do them at the end. But basically, I'm going to hand over to my guest to talk about the storytelling and myth making and the Flying Tigers. So over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Paul, I think I actually probably need you to move the PowerPoint for me, because somehow it's not giving me the option to next slide.
No problem. I'll do it. No problem.
Thank you. Yeah, we're in the right slide. So before we dive into the wartime myths and interpretations about the Flying Tiger in the U.S., allow me to situate this myth making about the Flying Tigers in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor through a story regarding how U.S. correspondents rushed in to cover the deeds of the Flying Tigers, which I think will give you a better sense about the importance of such storytelling. So on December 21st, 1941, 2 weeks after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, several leading American newspapers published an Associated Press report regarding a small squadron of U.S. volunteer flyers who astonished the Japanese Air Force by shooting down 4 enemy planes out of 10 at no cost over the skies of Kunming, southwest of China, during their first engagement. After that, newspapers circulated exciting stories about another small squadron of US volunteer flyers in Rangoon belonged to the same outfit that destroyed 20 to 40 Japanese aircraft at the cost of only 2 planes that occurred around Christmas 1941. When the Allies suffered a succession of Japanese blows elsewhere, newspaper correspondents considered this group's achievement as the greatest Allied victory in the Asia-Pacific theater at the time. So reporters flocked into Rangoon to cover the exploits of the flyers for the victory-hungry Americans. These American flyers belonged to the American Volunteer Group, the AVG, the Mercenary Air Force, better known as the original Flying Tigers. So why I call it the original Flying Tigers? Because later, after the disbandment of the AVG, the U.S. Army sent its Air Force units in China, and they kind of like inherited the nickname Flying Tigers. But here we are mainly focused on the original Flying Tiger, which was Mercenary Air Force units. That's not like officially in the U.S. military. So over the next 6 months, the AVG claimed the more combat victory in southern China and Burma against the much more powerful Japanese Air Force, while suffering few losses. So their aerial exploits and the shark-nosed Curtiss P-40 Mohawk fighter plane, which you see here on the screen, not only caught media attention in the US, but also inspired the popular 1942 Republic picture film Flying Tigers, starring John Wayne and other films, which we'll discuss more later in my presentation.
And once you get John Wayne in a story, it becomes global. I mean, that's once John Wayne commits to telling a story, that's it. It's world famous. So just thought I'd add that. Do you want me to move on the slide now?
Yeah, we can move on the slide. Thank you. Based on the examination of declassified documents, newspaper reports, magazine articles, popular biographies, and movies, so my presentation addressed a number of questions which you see on the screen about the ways that Americans portray the Flying Tiger and the meaning they attach to the AVG. So what role did Americans assign to their nation in the Asia-Pacific War through telling the stories of the Flying Tigers? Right? How did Americans perceive the Chinese as their allies and the Japanese as their enemies in the wartime storytelling about the Flying Tigers? What ideological values did Americans associate with the Flying Tigers, and what myths did Americans create? Did the AVG's combat records represent the achievement of teamwork or the significance of individualism? Did the AVG's accomplishments epitomize American superiority in mastering modern technology and machines? So these questions are were central to the interpretation of the Flying Tigers in the US during World War II. Okay, next slide, please.
Yep.
So analyzing how Americans depict the Japanese and Chinese in wartime stories about the Flying Tigers, my research reveals that Americans turned the tale of a fairly short mercenary campaign into a representation of America's role in the world. So few scholars have actually juxtaposed wartime American perceptions of the Japanese with images of the Chinese. So on one hand, historians who study American imagery of Japan have observed that American racism demonized and dehumanized the Japanese as animal-like beings. Wartime story of the Flying Tigers confirmed this and add that Americans also claimed the superiority over Japanese based on the faith in American technological advantages. On the other hand, scholars who examine American perceptions of the Chinese in the 1930s and during the Second World War have focused on how dominant American image of China shifted from a heathen and uncivilized land filled with villains like Fu Manchu in previous decades to an increasingly Christian democratic nation that was actively embracing the American model. So while occasionally acknowledging the reoccurrence of the earlier image during this period, such scholarly work often highlighted the transformation. However, as my research shows, the wartime story about the AVG continue to depict the Chinese as racially backward, passive, and hopeless people awaiting American rescue. So this view popularly coexists with the dominant image identified by other scholars. Wartime storytelling portrayed the flying tiger as benevolent and unselfish saviors who compassionately rescued the Chinese from the ruthless Japanese. And many Americans confirmed their superiority over the Chinese as well as the Japanese through interpreting the AVG's achievement in stories about how the how these flying tigers prove the supremacy of U.S. ideology and demonstrate America's advanced technology and machinery. So altogether, in wartime storytelling about the flying tigers, American portrayed East Asians as people awaiting American leadership, protection, and discipline, which justified America's intervention and future dominance in the region. So my research shows that the mythmaking about the flying tigers helped assure Americans of their benevolence, as well as superiority during the crisis of confidence and identity that followed Pearl Harbor, and the seemingly invincible Japanese advance in the Asia-Pacific region. The wartime popular interpretations and recollections of the flying tigers and the group's relation with the Chinese and Japanese reflected the idealized identities that many Americans attached to themselves. In this myth-making process, Americans downplayed or even forgot the detrimental impact of the AVG's misconduct, which actually soured the wartime US-China alliance. Meanwhile, wartime stories about the AVG also marginalized important contributions by the Chinese, who cooperated and offered vital support for the Flying Tigers and fought hard to defend their country. Thus, my presentation reviews the selection and distortion in the early process of memory formation.
Okay, are we moving on with the slides? Yep.
I think we're still good on. Can we actually go back to the previous
of course
slide?
we can.
Yeah, thank you. So by studying the wartime storytelling about the flying tigers, my research further challenged the good war image of World War II in American popular memory and the prevailing myths about the U.S. military capability. So scholars have challenged the good war myth by describing the brutality of the war, by revealing its contested memories. However, few scholars have discussed how Americans have downplayed the contribution by their wartime allies, especially non-Western allies, in memory construction. So the marginalized of America's allies' contribution has been a way for the U.S. to glorify its own military power and accomplishments, contributing to the mythology of the U.S. as a world savior and to build the blind faith in U.S. militarism. So China has been one of the significant World War II allies whose wartime contribution were forgotten. And recent works by historians have convincingly demonstrated that China was a valuable ally to the U.S., committed to fighting the Japanese and holding down a large number of Japanese troops, despite corruption and a lack of advanced military equipment. Therefore, the wartime storytelling about the flying tigers was not a unique episode in memorializing U.S. overseas intervention. Instead, it's part of the myth-making of how Americans take on the burden and rescue foreign nations and peoples. So I hope that will give you the basic idea, not only about the very scholarly part of the scholarly intervention of my research, but also the significance or the importance to discuss such issues in thinking about the contemporary world, and also the later overseas intervention, and also the memory of World War II, what we choose to emphasize, what we choose to marginalize.
Well,
Okay,
yeah, and thank you for that. And it just to butt in, it's reminding me of the work by Elizabeth Samet, the construction of the good war. This idea that we had, particularly in the 80s, with the American Greatest Generation books and the sort of beginning of the movies like Saving Private Ryan, of and we're not knocking our lovely American viewers are watching today, but this idea that the USA won the war on its own, that was important, and it's something that exists. But now we are acknowledging that the war is a collaborative affair and everybody's involved, and it's not anybody on their own. So this will be really interesting. So so back to you.
Thank you. I hope so. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so to understand what myth that the Americans attached to the Flying Tigers, we need to know the history of the Flying Tigers itself. Unlike what this group's name suggested, like American volunteer group, these American young men did not organize themselves to travel to China or fight against the Japanese for the Chinese. China's nationalist government came up with the idea of organizing an air force with up-to-date US warplanes and experienced pilots. So in the summer of 1940, as the war intensified with Japan, Chiang Kai-shek, the head of the Chinese nationalist government, decided to get 500 military aircraft, including bombers and pursuit planes, along with qualified military pilots from the US. And Claire Chanel, a retired U.S. Army Air Force captain at the time, who was advising Chiang Kai-shek directing the training of Chinese Air Force, went back to the U.S. and worked with members of emerging China lobby like Song Ziwen to obtain aircraft, pilots, and ground crews for this proposal. The efforts to construct these air units for China faced enormous difficulties in the US at the time. So many officials in FDR administration were not enthusiastic about the Chinese proposal or willing to let US servicemen get involved in military action against Japan at the time. Moreover, few military aircraft were available for China to purchase at the time. So the U.S. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall maintained that Washington should give the British the priority of ordering aircraft over China. And Curtis White, the manufacturer of the P-40 pursuit plane, which later the AVG used, revealed that they could not hand over any order to China before the summer of 1941. In order to get the planes earlier, China actually made a deal with Britain. That is, the British agreed to release 100 P-40s from their order to China in exchange of the same number of an improved model of P-40s, which would enter production soon at the time. So another major challenge was to hire experienced US military pilots and ground crews to fly and fix the planes. So the neutrality law prevented the US servicemen from accepting military employment abroad. A plan finally came up in the early of 1941 to purchase equipment and hire resigned US servicemen through a civilian agency rather than by the Chinese government. Although FDR gave the approval and the War Department directed the release of active servicemen to join the Flying Tigers, few branches in the U.S. military were willing to release their personnel. So by the summer of 1941, a few months before Pearl Harbor, the civilian agency recruited 99 pilots, most of whom were not experienced P-40 fighter pilots, but actually bomber fighters. And only like about 180 ground crewmen were also joined the AVG during the recruitment. So rather than being unanimously eager to assist China, these men joined the AVG for a variety of reasons. A few of them felt special bonds to China due to their missionary parents and therefore planned to join the fight for the Chinese. But many joined up for high salaries. So mechanics in the Flying Tiger receive about 350 to 400 US dollar per month. A wingman got about 600 US dollar a month, and a squadron commander got about 750 US dollar per month. In addition, the Chinese government offered a 500 US dollar bonus to pilots for each Japanese plane they destroyed. So this kind of payment was actually 2 to 5 times higher than what pilots could earn in the US military at the time. yeah, so other men signed up for either an adventure in the remote Orient or escape from the boredom of the peacetime service. So the allure of the Orient, the opportunity to improve their financial situation, um, and the chance to fight and prove themselves, all made joining the AVG a great option for the young men. Although everyone seemed to be highly motivated at the beginning, some could not endure the challenge of life in the tropics and the tough training and eventually quit. So, in a letter to the recruiting agency as a commander of this air unit, Claire Chanel actually complained that after the AVG member realized the harsh combat conditions in China, too many grumbled to him that they felt deceived by the agency into accepting the job. So the AVG's combat result were not insignificant, was less important than the unit's role in boosting American and Chinese morale. So right before Pearl Harbor, the AVG only had about 82 pilots with 62 obsolete P-40 that were able to fly. Throughout the existence of the AVG, the unit was struggling with a lack of replacement, spare parts, and even had an ammunition shortage, which significantly limited its combat ability. As to how many Japanese aircraft the AVG destroyed, Claire Chanel wrote in his memoir that he believed that by July the 4th, 1942, the date for the disbandment of the AVG, the unit definitely destroyed 299 Japanese planes and probably another 153 more. According to Claire Chanel, the AVG lost 12 P-40s in air combats and 61 more on the ground. And 13 pilots got killed in combat and another 10 lost in accidents. So the Flying Tigers certainly made contributions to the war against Japan. However, they did not accomplish their mission to defend the Burma Road supply line, as the Japanese cut off the Burma Road after the fall of Rangoon, which basically cut off the international supply line to China at the time. Nevertheless, the story of the Flying Tigers, especially their battles and accomplishments against the Japanese Air Force in the region, became popular in the US. The AVG was one of the few sources of positive news for Americans when the Japanese aggression seemed like invincible at the time. So next slide, please. So now let's talk about how Americans interpret the Flying Tiger during wartime. So many Americans did not see the Flying Tiger as mercenaries. When the Flying Tiger was in commission, U.S. journalists made efforts to downplay the mercenary nature of the Flying Tigers and extol them as unselfish heroes for both China and the U.S. Journalists divert American readers' attention from the Flying Tigers' unusually high salaries to the contributions these pilots made, and justify high salaries as the only way for China to recruit experienced U.S. combat pilots and mechanics. When the disbandment of the AVG approached, Time magazine published an article to praise the Flying Tiger as gallant fighters with democratic spirit and unsurpassable combat records. In a humorous way, the Time magazine's article also reviewed the Flying Tiger were expected to collect their checks for destroying enemy planes and enjoy spending the money. The article's indication of the mercenary nature of the AVG received harsh criticism from Chicago Daily Tribune, as the Chicago Daily Tribune charged Time with incorrectly and disrespectfully implying the Flying Tiger cared more about the money rather than fighting the enemy. And the Chicago Daily Tribune maintained the AVG was a powerful unit encouraged by the US government to save China and Burma. Next slide, please.
And do you think that the understanding of the word mercenary was very different in the 1940s to now? Because I'm going to kind of trivialize it now, but we've had all those Expendables movies with Sylvester Stallone over the last few years. So mercenaries are kind of maybe seen as I want to use the word sexy, but it's maybe not the right word. But back then, do you think mercenary had maybe a negative connotation to people globally of just simply being about the money?
I actually don't know about globally, but let's just think about how much money they are earning at the time,
Yeah,
and also I think you believe I think you just mentioned the historian Round going to talk about the wartime famine, the
yeah,
refugee situation, like the economic difficulty, all those things in China, and think about like the money spent, the kind of like I think also you're going to have Zach Fredman
yeah.
on your
Tomorrow,
channel
yeah.
talk about the alliance, and also yeah, like the different salary and how that caused a problem. So definitely, I think it's a problematic, and also it should not really hide. Like when the reporters reported the deeds of the Flying Tigers, the official name is a Martin Volunteer Group. I don't
Mm.
think that they really should have the perspective. I mean, the aspect of the mercenary nature of it, like the debate I just explained between Time Magazine and Chicago Daily Tribune. I think that that part is problematic to me.
We've talked about it a lot on this channel, the importance of language and what meanings are had by words like resistance, like collaboration, like neutrality. And I
Mhm.
think volunteer definitely has a much more inspirational sound than mercenary. And yet these pilots are clearly both. They're, depending on how you define it, they are, and they're also adventurers, and they're also, there's lots of words, but volunteer definitely has a better sound to it.
Yeah, it is, and it's also just really fit into like the big slogans at the time about
Mm,
like the the cause of World War II, what was World War II about,
yeah.
right?
Yeah. Oh well, back to you. But by the way, we're loving it. Everyone's thinking it's really good. So brilliant. Keep going.
Thank you.
Super.
Thank you. Yeah, so how let's continue talk about like the wartime interpretation of the Flying Tigers. So Hollywood filmmakers also present the Flying Tigers as valiant Americans who came to rescue the Chinese, where the Chinese contribution to the unit and the large war efforts fade out in the storytelling, as illustrated in the 1942 movie Flying Tigers, which you see a movie poster here on the right of the screen. Um, the storyline developed in the movie, the storyline developed around a new AVG replacement pilot named Woody Jason, who thought every member's intention was to make a fortune. After Jason joins this group, especially after Pearl Harbor, he no longer fights for money, although he continually lacks discipline. He realized that without the AVG's protection, many Chinese children will never get the chance to grow up. And he gives his bonus money to a widow of a pilot who was killed in action. And in the end, Jason takes on a suicidal bombing mission and sacrifices his life for the Chinese. Next slide, I'm going to show you some screenshots. As you see in those two following slides of screenshots of the film, the Chinese appeared in this film mainly as refugees, servants, peasants. You can also show next slide. Yeah, so these are some screenshots of the typical depiction of Chinese. So all of the Chinese depicted in this film need U.S. protection and tutelage. Other than showing several scenes of one ludicrous Chinese soldier who provided the AVG with negligible assistance in broken English, and several others as faceless guards and laborers, this movie really presents no scene of cooperation between the Chinese force and the Flying Tigers. The Chinese role in interpreting and in intelligence gathering was crucial to the AVG's
Mm.
operation. Their efforts to rescue down the AVG pilots were quite common because the Chinese nationalist government not only ordered its people to rescue down the US airmen, but also offered rewards to rescuers. Yet wartime storytelling about the Flying Tiger often omit such Chinese contributions. So the lack of positive portraits of the Chinese as allies in the film Flying Tigers received behind-the-scene criticism from the Office of War Information, the wartime U.S. propaganda agency. But the film critics in the agency barely consider this as a problem in the storytelling. The reviews at the Office of War Information noted that the film depicts the Chinese sympathetically, but they criticize it for portraying the Chinese adults as incapable and obedient. They also disapprove the lack of scenes emphasizing cooperation between the Chinese military and the Flying Tigers. However, movie reviewers who publish in a major U.S. newspaper like Washington Post, New York Times, Los Angeles Times did not really share the Office of War Information's criticism of the movie. Instead, these reviewers praised the movie as well made and didn't challenge the movie's marginalization of Chinese resistance or cooperation with the Flying Tigers. So despite the extensive assistance and cooperation the Flying Tigers received from the Chinese military and civilians, wartime movies, news report, and nonfiction accounts in the US rarely told such stories. Next slide, please. Okay, so the storyline in the 1942 movie Lady from Chungking is one of the few exceptions that depict the Chinese resistance against Japan, as well as their rescue of downed Flying Tiger pilots. But it was not free of stereotyping the Chinese. So you can see a movie poster on the slide. The Office of War Information praised this low-budget movie for depicting the Chinese determination to resist Japan. So this movie departed from previous Hollywood depiction of the Chinese by focusing on the story of a Chinese village's resistance and portraying a strong Chinese female guerrilla leader, Madam Queen Mei, played by Anna Wong, as you see in the left side of the poster. However, a close look of the movie tells a different story. So during the rescue mission, Queen Mei tells the wounded AVJ pilot that China could not afford to lose him. Although the villagers put up guerrilla resistance to the Japanese, they ultimately depend on the AVG's air attack to destroy a Japanese troop train. This again affirmed to the American audience that China counted on the US. And the strong character Kun Mei might indicate that even Chinese women were fully armed to fight against Japan. But as you can see on next slide, please. On the screen, I have the screenshots of the movie. So Queen Mei has to seduce the Japanese general to gather intelligence, and finally she is unable to escape her fate, which is executed by the Japanese. So here you can see some of the scenes to show like how this Chinese guerrilla, female guerrilla leader, like seduced the Japanese general. Next slide, please. So as you can see from these screenshots, all the Chinese men around Queen Mei appear to be weak, lack creativity and leadership ability, and subject to her guidance. So the script or the subtitle in the screenshot give you a sense of this Chinese male guerrilla soldiers' behavior depicted in the movie, that they didn't trust their leader. So considering the desired gender relations in the US at the time, the depiction of Queen Mei and the Chinese male guerrilla soldiers were not so positive. In fact, the character Queen Mei actually fit into the pattern of the so-called dragon lady in the US imagination, which was seductive, mysterious, strong, and aggressive. And Chinese men's dependence on such women reinforced the stereotype of China as a weak and problematic nation. Although the Office of War Information encouraged the Hollywood to follow the U.S. government's wartime propaganda guideline and depict China as a valuable and competent ally, the persistence of racism and paternalism led Hollywood to continue portraying the Chinese in the stereotypes. Next slide, please.
And do we know that if there was any Chinese involvement in these films in terms of behind the camera, so script writing, advisory, or was it all just Hollywood? Because in this era, we know that in the war films, there were those kind of body of Hollywood Oriental actors who would appear as Korean one week, Japanese the next week, Chinese the week after, and they just did the rounds as whatever the Hollywood needed that week in terms of Orientals. But we know that existed, but were there any people involved in these films from within China who actually had any kind of say from the government? I'm guessing no.
Yeah, I don't think so. Like from my research based on the archives, I haven't found such evidence seeing like Hollywood really invited the Chinese opinion on this. However, I think for the 1942 movie Flying Tiger, they did invited Chiang Kai-shek to read like a piece that they put in front of the film to show like
Okay.
how Chinese appreciate the flying tigers to confirm the story told in the movie.
Okay. Next
Yeah,
slide, is it?
yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were going to say something.
Oh, sorry. So with the next slide. If we're not next slide, but I can whatever. Sorry, my
Okay,
mistake.
yeah. Next slide. Sorry.
No, it's all good.
Okay, so therefore, the wartime storytelling about the flying tigers not only overshadowed the Chinese efforts to improve and defend their country, but also helped extend the stereotype of the Chinese as racially inferior and incapable. So scholars often held that in the 1930s and 40s, most Americans changed their impression of China into a country that was becoming an American-style modern nation and under U.S. guidance. Such scholarly work contended that paternalistic benevolence and gender romanticization became dominant in the American view of China during this period. And this paternalistic and condescending perception, which reflect more about American notions of uplifting others than anything about the nature of the Chinese, saw the Chinese as capable of learning, evolving. However, the popular stories of the flying tigers continue spreading the stereotype of the Chinese as backward, primitive, and incapable. And this stereotype actually paved the road for some Americans to claim China as a backward and incompetent country after they realized in the post-war era that China did not follow the American model. Next slide, please. Okay, so in addition to stereotyping the Chinese, the U.S. wartime storytelling also downplayed the misconduct committed by the Flying Tigers without acknowledging that such misconduct soured the alliance with local Chinese civilians and soldiers even before the U.S. Army, the U.S. military officially stationed its army units in China. Before the AVG's first battle, sexual relations with local women and smuggling already caused the problems. During their service in China, the Flying Tigers actually gained a reputation of getting drunk, reckless driving, assaulting Chinese civilians, and even looting, which caused local resentment. However, the AVG's disturbing misconduct did not really get much attention in the wartime storytelling back in the US. Among the very little coverage, the US media denied the existence of a drinking problem and depicted the Flying Tiger as family men who sent most of their salary back to their families and were eager to reunite with their wives and girlfriends back in the US. So by marginalizing the misconduct of Flying Tigers, wartime storytelling turned a blind eye on the actual territory rights and the privilege that the AVG enjoyed in China. It also ignored the strong Chinese popular resentment against unequal treaty system, including the actual territorial rights, which basically means like if these foreigners they commit a crime in China, they were not subject to Chinese laws. It's similar to diplomatic immunity. So, in other words, the U.S. reporters and writers focused exclusively on the AVG's assistance to China and turned the story of the AVG really into a symbol of U.S. benevolence. Okay, next slide. So Americans also try to comprehend the role of individuals in the AVG's legendary combat achievements in wartime storytelling, although such interpretations seem to be divided into two narratives. So one narrative highlights the significance of teamwork among the AVG pilots under Claire Chennault's leadership. For example, in an article discussing why the AVG was so successful, the magazine Collier's affirmed that Claire Chennault's strategy of teamwork was key. Colliers further explained that Chennault taught the flyers to never attack alone, as he teamed the three AVG pilots together and instruct them to fight in a unique formation. So next slide, I'm going to show you a comic panel that kind of adopt the similar narrative. However, this vision of teamwork was relatively narrow, since it mainly referred to Claire Chennault's strategy of teaming up like 3 pilots together. This interpretation largely neglected the contribution by the ground crews, let alone the Chinese military force and civilians who cooperated with the Flying Tigers. Moreover, the heavily credited to Claire Chennault encouraged an opposite narrative which really highlighted individualism rather than like teamwork. And this opposite narrative, which emphasized the significance of individual Flying Tigers' role and achievement, gradually became more prominent in the US. There were countless stories centered on the discussion of the AVG's success, on Claire Chennault's techniques, abilities to take advantage of existing resources and to outthink the Japanese. In addition to spotlighting Claire Chennault, American newspapers and magazines also sold very thrilling stories of individual Flying Tigers. For example, how a AVG pilot outsmarted the Japanese in an air battle or survived after parachute in a remote area. So Hollywood movie is another place to observe this emphasis on individualism rather than teamwork in wartime stories about the Flying Tigers. So in the movie Flying Tigers, which we just talked about, although teamwork is emphasized several times in squadron leaders' conversation with other pilots, the story developed around Jason, an individualistic rebel with little concern for discipline, who however become the best pilot in the unit. Next slide, please. So individualism is the dominant theme also in the 1945 film God is My Copilot, adapted from the best-selling memoir by Robert Scott, a U.S. Army Air Force cargo pilot who wanted to join the Flying Tigers. So the memoir and the movie illustrate how Scott borrowed a P-40 from Chennault to strafe and dogfight the Japanese on their own, become an unofficial Flying Tigers. So according to the story, every time before he takes off, Scott asks the ground crew to paint the very top of his plane in a different color. And after several rounds, Scott gives the Japanese an impression that a new AVG squadron is attacking them. I'm going to show you next slide. I'm going to show you more screenshot of this movie. So as you can see from this screenshot, the AVG men and also the general public in the US all admire Scott for his combat skills and achievements. So in the movie, Claire Chennault praised Scott as a one-man Air Force. Film critics for major U.S. newspapers like New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal did not really challenge the film's emphasis on individualism. Instead, they praised the scene of Scott's solo strafing and dogfighting. Meanwhile, the book reviews for the memoir also praise individualism, especially in the format of an individual's ability to judge orders from authority as an important measure to win a war. So the wartime the wartime stories of individual flying tigers, heroic deed and achievements assured the domestic audience the righteousness and efficiency of American individualism when confronting the Japanese. As historians have revealed, wartime U.S. propaganda and popular culture diminished the Japanese as an obedient and collective mass devoid from individuality. In contrast to the prosperous and democratic American way of life that is based on individuality. Such as mythmaking became a way to mobilize Americans in the war against Japan, and the wartime stories about the Flying Tigers also contribute to such efforts. The glorification of individualism also explained why the stories about the Flying Tigers teamwork did not really become as popular as the story about individual Flying Tigers, and why the story about teamwork also intimate individualism. Okay, next slide, please. So wartime stories interpreted the Flying Tigers' capability of shooting down far more Japanese planes than they lost, as evidence of American mastery of technologies and machines. So some American reporters admit that the Flying Tigers were flying outdated pursuit planes compared to the Japanese one, but they praise Claire Chanel and the Flying Tiger pilots for maximizing the advantage of their P-40s and for outsmarting the Japanese airmen. So influential newspapers and magazines like Time Magazine, Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, New York Times all praise Claire Chanel and the AVG pilots for using strategies, training, skills to outwit and outfight the Japanese. The Washington Post even assured its readers that most of the crashed Flying Tiger, the AVJ planes went down because of overheated engines or the lack of spare parts or like aviation fuel rather than Japanese bullets. Next slide, please. So I'm going to show you another slide from a comic panel that you can see a similar narrative that really emphasizes the ability of the Flying Tiger to bring like their heat plane back. Yet not all Americans believe that Japan could produce better aircraft than the US. So many of the wartime accounts insisted on the superiority of American planes. Next slide, you can see from a comic panel again.
And just before we move on, that those people at the tail of that aircraft, they're white, they're not Chinese as well. So there's been no attempt by the artist to show that there are Chinese workers on these aircraft. That seems to be the flyers themselves looking at the damage, which is ridiculous because when an aircraft lands, it's the ground crew that do the work of assessing it. So even in that image, there's a reinforcement of the idea that the Chinese are only in the corner somewhere doing something unimportant. Yeah, but
yeah, I totally agree.
yeah, well, there we are.
Okay. Yeah. So the Japanese Zero fighters and the US P-40 fighters each had their respective advantage and disadvantages. The Japanese aircraft had better maneuverability in climbing and turning, while the AVG's P-40 was faster in diving and straight away flying. The American plane also had a sturdy construction, especially its protective armor and self-sealing fuel tank, but it was an outdated model as we discussed before. American reporters praised the P-40 for outperforming Japanese planes and for demonstrating the superiority of US-built warplanes. So some commentators question the Japanese ability to independently design their planes. As you can see from the Life magazine on next slide. Okay, so it claimed that the engine of a Zero was designed in the US, as you see from the strip at the left corner, which I put, if you cannot see clear, I put it on here. So
Sorry,
yeah, the Life magazine further reported that the Japanese did not have creativity and were flying their so-called homemade copies of the US planes with unsuccessful modifications. Life also claimed that the only Japanese invention was to, quote, fly and dive with their samurai swords, quote. So similar narrative can be found in other popular newspaper and magazines in the US. The accusation of the Japanese as imitative reinforced the deep-rooted American belief that the Japanese always modeled America. This narrative not only portrayed the Japanese as racially and technologically inferior and lacking originality, but also helped Americans conform their identity as more advanced and civilized, as well as their faith in the universality of American ways. So other wartime stories about the Flying Tigers praise the U.S. mastery of modern technology and machines by claiming the superiority of American warplanes and pilots together. So, for example, Flying Magazine contended that the AVG's amazing combat records resulted from three factors that came from the US. So, first, Claire Chanel and the US pilots who outthought and outfought the Japanese. Second, the American engineers who designed the P-40s. And finally, the standard combat training that the AVG pilots received from the US military. Meanwhile, the Flying magazine assured its readers that the Japanese pilots often missed their targets completely due to their insufficient training and the lack of understanding of their instrument. So again, through interpreting the combat achievements, um, the of the AVG over the Japanese, many Americans found reassurance of their identity at the time of crisis. Next slide. It's undeniable that the Flying Tigers made combat contribution to the war against Japan. However, the wartime stories of the Flying Tigers told by Americans had their own life and significance that really went beyond their combat achievements. Thus, although the Flying Tiger was in combat for less than 7 months and actually ended its mission, I'm talking about the original Flying Tiger here, 3 years before the Allies achieved the victory over Japan, stories about this group had a long-lasting legacy. They helped Americans regain confidence and confirm their identities after the tremendous shock caused by Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor and seemingly unbeatable advance in the Asia-Pacific region. As my presentation shows, American news reporters, filmmakers, popular writers all found ways to interpret the Flying Tigers' deeds and combat achievements as the examples of U.S. global benevolence and superiority. Wartime stories depict the Flying Tiger as unselfish and humanitarian saviors who went to protect and rescue the Chinese, not mercenaries. This story praised the AVG for being a democratic, liberating, and civilizing force that represented and spread American values abroad. Some Americans interpret the AVG's combat achievements as a result of teamwork among groups, but most choose to glorify the Flying Tigers' achievement as a product of American individualism. American also recognized the AVG's combat victory over the Japanese air power as a proof of American mastery of modern technology and machines. So in this wartime mythmaking process, Americans overlook the negative impact of the Flying Tigers' misconduct, which restored the U.S.-China alliance on the ground before Washington officially sent the U.S. military to China. And then wartime stories about the Flying Tiger also really marginalized the contribution by the Chinese military and civilian who cooperated and assisted the group extensively. This story continues stereotyping the Chinese as inferior and incapable people who need American protection and guidance. So the stories of the Flying Tigers that Americans told during the war did not really mark a unique episode in U.S.-China relations. Instead, the wartime story demonstrated the persistence of American racism and paternalism toward the Chinese. The perseverance and interaction of such prejudice result in the fluctuating image of China, especially the Chinese nationalist government. So during the 30s and 40s, especially during the Asia-Pacific War, many Americans, such as Pearl Buck, Henry Luce, FDR, started to perceive China as capable of evolving into a so-called modern nation and become a valuable ally to the U.S. in the Far East, although they established this belief based on the assumption that China could only become modern by adopting the American model. However, the popular stories like the one about the Flying Tigers really helped to extend the older exclusionary racial perception of China. And in this narrative, Americans saw China as a backward, incapable, inferior, and awaiting American rescue. After the war against Japan ended, these two narratives continued influencing American perceptions and policies toward China. So one group of Americans felt that the Chinese nationalist government would allow the American model, follow the American model and lead China toward modernization and democracy. From their perspective, the U.S. government failed to provide necessary aid and betrayed the Chinese nationalists, which eventually resulted in the so-called loss of China to communism. The other group of Americans saw China as backward, hopeless, and blamed the nationalist government's inability and corruption for losing China. The popular wartime story of the Flying Tigers really helped to preserve the perception of an inferior and miserable China awaiting U.S. aid and tutorage. The wartime storytelling and mythmaking about the flying tigers was also not an unparalleled episode in America's assessment of their nation's contribution to the victory of World War II, as well as America's accomplishments in many other overseas interventions. So the legend of the flying tigers was just an early step toward the mythmaking of the U.S. That the U.S. could decisively save the world from the Axis. Regarding the victory over Japan, the popular narrative in the US, as we know, claimed the dropping of the atomic bombs and the war single-handedly, a claim that really fails to consider the contribution by America's allies. Historians have convincingly demonstrated the important contribution of the Soviet Union in defeating Nazi Germany and in pushing Japan to surrender, which Americans, or at least many Americans, have downplayed in popular narratives. So similarly, American popular memory has significantly marginalized the contribution by the Chinese, who had not only resisted Japan for a longer period and restrained the large numbers of Japanese troops, but also cooperated closely with the U.S. military operations and strategies. So, in other words, when commemorating the victory of World War II, Americans has substantially marginalized the significance of their allies while exaggerating of their country's contribution. And this narrative has helped strengthen the American myth that the U.S. can use its superior military power to save and reshape the world according to the American principles that represent universal standards and values. Okay, that's it of my presentation. Thank you.
Wow. Well, brilliant. And I think a lot of people watching, myself including, are realizing we kind of probably realized some of this stuff already, but didn't really want to admit it. You know, there's people saying that they read the Robert Scott book when they were young kids, and they were inspired by it and things like that. And yet now we're having it pointed out to us that, yeah, it's racially problematic, it's patronizing, and it's portrayed of the Chinese and what have you. So we like that kind of, we like history that makes us question things. That's important. You go away and you go, yeah. And propaganda is important. Propaganda can be positive. I mean, we've talked a lot on this channel about the Battle of Britain, the way Britain memorialized the fighter pilots more in 1940 than they did the bomber pilots and the coastal command. But because that's what was needed at the time. They needed to find a hero figures for the benefit of the country. It wasn't fair to everybody else, but at the time it was necessary. And I can kind of see your points from 2 points of view. Yes, you're absolutely right. But of course, in 1942, there was a message that had to be told. And those films like Flying Tigers did have an impact, even if a positive impact, even if they had also a long-term negative impact. If that's where I am with this right now. But we have, if you're prepared to answer some questions for you. So Ian Carr, regular viewer, is asking about what access journalists got to the AFG and reports. I mean, obviously, individual pilots were being interviewed by people, but did they get any access to the Chinese side of things? Obviously, there were liaison officers there. How did information from the airfields reach the wider world? Is it probably a better way of wording it?
Okay. That's actually a bigger question and really related a lot related to wartime reporting. So definitely like there are those sorry, I forgot the term, but the the Flying Tiger, they have the person to like contact media. They want, I mean, they have
like a press officer, yeah.
And then you also have all the like war correspondents sent by U.S. media to station in China and cover all the news.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, if there's a press officer, the press officer is theoretically only releasing what he wants to release, or rather than necessarily what the journalist wants to see. But it's a big topic. It could go anywhere. But this one is a really big subject. So feel free to address this either individually or kind of make a comment, because we do understand China is a big place. But Tim Sampson is saying, how does modern China view the AFG and American involvement as a whole? So that's a big subject, because there are lots of people in China with lots of different things. But if you could summarize it, perhaps based on your research, I mean, if you were to speak to people in modern China about the American volunteers in 1940, how are they perceived generally? Is there a single view, or is it multifaceted?
Okay, I assume like Tim Thompson's question about modern China is referring to like China, maybe in the past few years, maybe like 20 years or so.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so the story of the flying tiger is actually much well known in China because I think part of it was the efforts in the 80s and 90s, even 2000. We actually in China you have those like memorials, museum built dedicated to the flying tiger. Some of these are actually grassroots efforts, but some of them are actually top-down state efforts. So especially I think in the 80s and 90s really emphasized like the wartime friendship as that's in the aftermath of the reproach war or the normalization of US-China relations. But definitely you will also see the tendency of emphasize like more and more emphasis on the Chinese contribution or the Chinese cooperation with the group, or sometimes even like in the later in the later U.S. Army Air Forces groups, which inherited the nickname Flying Tigers, but they do have like Chinese American policy and to emphasize the contribution or the works of these people to it's kind of also correlated to the Chinese nationalism to emphasize the Chinese part of the Chinese cooperation, Chinese contribution. But I think in general, definitely in China, the story of the flying tiger is much better well known, especially
Okay.
after the early 1980s, way better known to the Chinese Republic than if you grab someone from the US. But Paul, before I proceed, I do want to talk one thing. You commented before we dive in the question about the propaganda. So I think one of the things like my research shows is, I mean, especially about this wartime part, it's not really like official propaganda try to portray one thing, but it's more about like the persistence of racism and paternalism in American popular culture, because you see like repeatedly, especially in the case of Hollywood movie, that the Office of War Information, which was the wartime propaganda agency, really try to like encourage Hollywood, but I mean, didn't really have the absolute power, right? It did try to encourage Hollywood to like revise the narrative, like portray the Chinese as like valuable ally, but they were not able to do so. And there are also, I mean, there are also other scholars did research on that, and I think we kind of come up with the same conclusion that there is a more persistence of like racism and paternalism in American popular culture that not necessarily align well even with like a propaganda, when the propaganda seemed to be like a aim to contribute to war efforts.
No, I mean, and obviously the subject of Asian portrayals on screen is a massive, great subject that people have talked about extensively and stereotypes over the years, and it's still something that needs to be addressed and improved today. But that's another big subject. But a good question coming up, because you talked about the fact that China is talking more about its own involvement in this aspect, and not just its conventional war against the Japanese, but its particular involvement in supporting the Flying Tigers. So Trent Telenko is asking if you can speak about the logistical efforts of the Chinese nationalist government in supporting the Flying Tigers. For example, the Chinese made the AFG's airfields, not Americans. So, is there data about just how much work was done and how much it cost and how many people were involved? And is it a story that's being told? Well, you kind of said it is. If I was in China today, could I find information in books quite readily about the Chinese, let's say, airfield construction?
Chinese airfield construction, I don't think that's such a big story, because that also really involved in like a lot of those airfield was actually constructed by like bare hands or agriculture, like the use of cow or something. I don't really think like that part of the story really got that much emphasis. However, how the Chinese people like rescue the flying tiger, that's a huge story in China. Not only flying tigers, but also like other pilots. I mean, the later U.S. Army, Air Force, and also the Doolittle raids that crash landed in China, all those things. And in regarding to like the support provided by the Chinese to the U.S. another thing is interpreters, because most of these American fighters, pilots, ground crew, whatever, they don't speak Chinese at all. They don't understand Chinese at all. So actually, the Chinese nationalist gun, I think probably Zach Friedman would be even better to talk about these things even more. I believe you had him maybe for tomorrow or something. So the Chinese nationalist government actually had those special schools and camps that train interpreters to work with the American military personnel. And also another thing I think got a lot of emphasis in today's China, not really today, but maybe a few years ago.
Yeah.
It's about intelligence gathering. So the one of the things actually even Claire Chanel in his memoir also talk about he's very proud about the so-called intelligence system he developed himself, which is use Chinese people maybe on the ground and use all kinds of signals, maybe telescope. I don't know what's telescope or something. But to communicate one place saw the Japanese plane approaching this and that. So that's another contribution the Chinese did to the operation of the Flying Tigers in terms of intelligence gathering. Also, another thing is just really to provide the food, provide the place for the Flying Tigers to live, and also, I think both Ronald and also Zach Friedman will be better. Talk about these because I think in their book they also have different examples about how the efforts to provide the living standards of these U.S. airmen really put a very harsh impact on the local Chinese. I think one of the example Ronald had in his book Forgotten Ally is about these U.S. airmen, they want to eat beef, and China is not really a country that produces that much beef. And to the extent that the local people really resent that they have to kill the cow they use to plow their field to satisfy the food for the American airmen. So I think that may also give you a perspective about how much efforts that the Chinese actually put at the time to cooperate with the Flying Tiger to support the work of the Flying Tigers.
I mean, it seems to me what you're saying is very much how we're now addressing the Battle of Britain, in that we now realize the air defense of Britain is way more than just the pilots in those fighters. It's, that you're talking about the observation done by Chinese. Well, that has a direct connection to the Royal Observer Corps, who are in Britain, who are the people who are using the sites and things like that on the coast, watching and counting numbers of aircraft. And clearly, you've just said yourself, that's part of the success here, is that it's not just going up in the air in an aircraft, it's going up in the air with enough information about where the enemy might be coming from, where the new airfields are being built in, which routes they're using, what the weather is going to be like for this operation, so on and so forth. So as we're beginning to understand, is that the story of the pilots is important, but it's only the tip of a spear of all these people behind. And that's the story that needs to be told with the Flying Tigers, that it's part of a very complex system. And as you say, just simply in feeding people as well. And, I've done shows in the past with Ben Kite about the for example, Royal Australian Air Force later in the war in 44 and 45 in New Guinea and Bougainville and places like that, and how incredibly important the ground crews were because of just climate. And you said there's not enough spares, there's not enough aircraft frames. So to get a maximum amount of aircraft in the skies at any one time is all due to the ground crew and nothing to do with the pilots. The pilots ride them in the sky, but without that support network, it's useless. And so I think it seems to me that's the narrative that needs to develop out of this, is that the Flying Tigers the pilots is an interesting starting point, but there's a lot more to it, and definitely the intelligence aspect. So and we've had some more questions about, there are museums in China to the Flying Tigers and things like that. So what would you kind of wind things up? What would you like to see happen in the next kind of 20 years in terms of understanding both the role of the Flying Tigers, but China generally? Because this is what we're discussing over these 2 weeks. I've got historians in Britain, America, and other places there. But where do you think that we should be going with our understanding of this whole greater war?
I think take the perspective, talk about the museum and also narrative. I would like to see how both sides acknowledge that the cooperation from both sides really helped defeat like shared or common enemies, which is what we need in the contemporary world. As the U.S.-China relation have become like one of the most important or the most important international relations. So rather than confrontation, rather than yeah, I would like to see like how maybe both sides can realize the importance of the allies, the possibility of cooperation while acknowledging the difference to like battle against like a common enemies, no matter it's pandemic, it's climate change or some other issues.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I mean, and people are talking in the sidebar about hearing different voices, as we were talking, you and I, before we went live. We need to address these very, very famous events from different points of view, because the more different points of view we view them from, the better we will understand it, the better we will understand that. I think a lot of people would go into this not really thinking of China as an ally. I think they would think of China, in a sense, fighting its own war against Japan, and then the Americans and Brits and Canadians and Australians are fighting their war against Japan. When, as we now realize, it's one big war, and China are as vital an ally as the Soviet Union were, and as Canada and all these other countries there. And it's about changing our perspectives of this. And I will go and watch the Flying Tigers original movie again with perhaps a different attitude now, and realize it's part of the story, but it's not the entire story. So, to wind things up, and what are your long-term hopes for your career? I mean, obviously you're in the USA now. You're interested in this military history, but where do you see yourself going in the future?
Oh, that's a difficult question to ask, because as you know, like the job market for history PhD is not so promising.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm open to all possibilities. If there are tenure tracking position, I mean, I will be interested, but I haven't really seen much of like diplomatic history or like the U.S. Asian relations, memory studies. So I'm also interested in doing more like public engagement, maybe like works in like museums, memorial project. I'm also interested in opportunity like that. And also, I think I can also like I can also do like maybe academic support work, just maybe from another different way of like what would be the word, like help with the research and help with like a more critical education, higher education. Those are my interests.
Cool. Well, I mean, people have enjoyed it today, and I think we've been confronted with some cold, hard truths. I think that we need that sometimes, because all of us as a Brit, I'm naturally proud of Britain's involvement in World War II. I'm naturally proud of my family members who served, but I'm also conscious of the fact that they couldn't do what they do without everybody else doing what they're doing. And the Flying Tigers is an interesting example of how one story has been told one particular way that's not necessarily the wrong way, but it's a way, and there are other ways of looking at it, and looking at it from a Chinese point of view and your own point of view is really important. So I think people will be going away with some mulling over some things, thinking about some things, and that's really important. So I will extend the invitation. If you want to come back in the future and talk about something else, that would be very, very, very great, because you're good at what you do. I'll just remind viewers, tomorrow our show is in the middle of the day, 11 a.m. UK time. Zach Frebin is coming on, actually beaming in live from China. So we've actually got Zach from China joining us, talking about the occupation, the policies. So we'll extend today's conversation. So folks, thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for your comments, and thank you very much to you, Aries, for joining us. It's been really good, and I will see you again, I hope. So did you enjoy talking to our group?
Yeah, are we still live or?
No, we're still us. We're still here. I haven't finished yet, but it's been great talking to you. So thank you very much. Cheers, everybody. This is Paul Woodhouse for World War II TV saying I will see you all next time. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Bye, thank you.